On this episode, we look at the role of walking in evacuating New York on 9/11. Walking also played a key role during the 2003 blackout. We talk with an evacuation planner in Albany. Finally, we look at obstacles to evacuating in the Washington, D.C. region. Stay tuned. We're in Brooklyn, New York, talking with Stephen Faust, who's a retired transportation planner. Where were you on 9/11?
On the morning of 9/11, I was bicycling into work. I worked at the Federal Transit Administration in Lower Manhattan, about a block or so from the Brooklyn Bridge. And I was on the Brooklyn Bridge just coming around the Manhattan Tower, and the Trade Center exploded in my face. I didn't hear the airplane. I just see this gigantic explosion coming out of the tower, looking like a Hollywood extravaganza, which is basically all the gasoline exploding. And my first thought was somebody stuck one mother large bomb up there, because I had been in the building back in 93 when they bombed it the first time and had to hike down from the 82nd floor. So my second thought was, how was the 82nd floor? Because I had friends who worked up there, and I started counting up from the Sky Lobby on 72, got to 82, 83, 84, 85. At 86, all hell was breaking loose. And, I realized that those people ran and they could get out of there. But it took us 2 hours to get out back in 93. So I was just, didn't know how to make a decision. Do I go down to the Trade Center and try to help? And I don't know what I really could have been doing down there other than just get in the way. Or to go up to my office, which at this time I was at General Services, and we actually provide high-tech services to other government agencies, and hope maybe we could provide some kind of technical support. So I call my office, though, and let them know that the Trade Center had been bombed and that possibly somebody would be setting off something around the federal building as well, which would obviously be a target. And then I just got on the bike and rode down there a minute and a half later, and of course nobody down at my building even knew the thing had happened. I go upstairs, and we're trying to follow what's going on. We get radios, TV going, and I get a call in from one of my colleagues coming in on the train from New Jersey, and he says, "I heard there's a problem. Should I come into Newark and get on Path?" And I said, No, forget Path. You don't want Path. And I'm starting to tell him, go on to Penn Station. And about that time, we're facing the north side, so I can't see the Trade Center from my window, but I can see people on a roof just north of us looking at the Trade Center, and I'm feeling a rumble in my feet, and then hear a crash, an explosion, and I see their faces drop. And I'm going, oh, and then from down the hall, somebody watching a TV says another plane just hit the other tower. And I very quietly get on the phone and say, forget about coming into New York, go home. About that time, I decided that I was not going to get anything useful done. And I started packing my gear, get my bike, and the building, about that time, the building was declared evacuation. And I took my big risk of the day, which was to get on an elevator with the bike, hoping I wouldn't be trapped in it, and said, that's it, I'm heading home. We get downstairs, and I'm 2 blocks from the foot of the Brooklyn Bridge, and I ride over on the bike to the Brooklyn Bridge, and by this time, the Brooklyn Bridge's walkway is absolutely packed. There are thousands of people streaming across out of Manhattan. Subways have been stopped. People realize that work's over. That's it. We got to get home, evacuate. So the walkways are totally full. The roadways are still full of cars. And I knew that the Manhattan Bridge walkway had just been opened by the New York City DOT a month before. This had been closed for 40 years, and they rebuilt it and reopened it. So a couple of other cyclists were there because we couldn't possibly have ridden in that many people. It would not have been proper, safe, we would have been walking over the bridge for a half hour. And I told the other cyclists, follow me, we'll go to the Manhattan Bridge. And we rode the quarter of a mile or so up to Canal Street and got to the Manhattan Bridge, which was practically empty because, as I said, almost nobody knew that it was now rebuilt. So we were crossing the walkway there, and I'm looking back over my shoulder, and honestly, I felt like Lot's wife looking back at the towers burning. It was just horrendous. There's just nothing. There's nothing practical anybody from the outside could do at that point. And rode on into Brooklyn, and normally my trip is 25, 30 minutes from house to Lower Manhattan. I'm 4.5, 5 miles. I was home within a half an hour of leaving the office. I was actually home and at the house before the tower started to collapse. And I got in, grabbed some cameras, went up to my roof, and was up there taking pictures just after the collapse. And all I got is this gigantic pillar of smoke and fire. And about 15 minutes later, we're getting ashfall here over the house. And it was, I rode home. Thousands and thousands of people were walking over the bridges. But a little bit later, they just simply took over the roadways of the bridge, and we evacuated from probably 500,000 people out of Manhattan back to Brooklyn. It's a tremendous population, and none of the subways were working, and this is how people got home.
And a couple years later, you had the massive blackout in the Northeast.
Yep.
Where were you then?
This time I was up in my office, and the lights blink and go out, and go, that's interesting. It's we figure, it's a local problem or something, and then we start again checking, trying to think whether we had battery radios or what it's very hard to even find out what's going on, because if you don't have a battery radio, your TVs aren't going to work. Most of our phones, of course, were dead because they were based on computer digital telephones, and if you don't have backup power for those, they're going to die. So the only connections we had were the old POTS telephones hooked up for our fax machines, the data or fax lines. So we hung out and sort of, again, trying to see if we could help people, but after an hour or two of that, it became pretty clear that there really wasn't much of anything we could do. No work could get done. Computers were down. And again, it was time to leave. I think we actually had emergency power on one elevator bank. So again, I came down. Didn't have to walk down 18 floors with the bike, but I would have. That would have been not too terrible. And once again, the Brooklyn Bridge, I could see the Brooklyn Bridge from our windows, and it was packed. There were nobody on the roadway, but the walkway was solid, shoulder to shoulder. And so again, I headed to the Manhattan Bridge. Now this time, this is 2 years later, in 2003, in August, and people knew that the walkway was there, so it was packed as well. And this time I had to go up on the roadway and again rode across to Brooklyn. This time I had had a camera with me, which is something I was really upset about, not having a camera back in 01. And so I took some shots, and you could look back at the Brooklyn Bridge and you look at the people crowded through. And again, 500,000 or more people walking back out of Manhattan. They were using all the bridges, all the East River bridges. There's 4 of them. They first started with the walkways, and as the masses of people would normally be taking the subways hit the bridges heavily, the overflow went out onto the roadways, and they occupied roadways very successfully. Like there's shots people have shown me from the Queensboro where it's just covered all the way. There's like 4 or 5 lanes there, and it's just people all the way across. And it got people out. And one of the peculiar things with the blackout was people in Staten Island, many of them got into Brooklyn, got down through to the Verrazano Bridge, and then tried to cross to Staten Island from Bay Ridge, Verrazano was designed with walkways, but Robert Moses decided that he didn't want to put the walkways in to keep people from committing suicide and spoiling his bond issue ratings. Strange things was, of course, that it didn't have any impact on that at all, because instead people drive up, dump the car, block traffic, and then jump. All it just meant is you can't ride your bike or walk across into Staten Island. So they reach the end of the bridge, and they're standing there looking stupid because the transit authority buses were just too far and few between for the masses that were trying to make it across. So people were hitchhiking, people were waiting for the buses, people were standing there looking dumb for hours. And it was really an interesting difference between the East River bridges, where people had walkways, knew that they could use them, and when they became overloaded, they could take over some of the roadways. And here's the Verrazano with 12 lanes. And the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority staff were worried about moving cars and couldn't figure out, either didn't know or couldn't figure out how to accommodate out of all these 12 lanes some space for getting thousands of people back home. It's a very strange situation. But walking and biking moved a heck of a lot of people.
And we see the importance of having pedestrian facilities on a bridge. And as you mentioned, they get overwhelmed, you start taking over lanes of traffic. What can be done at that point to maintain some sort of order to, so emergency vehicles can get through, or whatever reason you might still need to keep a lane open?
Right. Well, one of the things is I think that there really wasn't a good emergency plan put together by the police. They really weren't prepared for people to suddenly take over the roadways. And had they been thinking about this, I would have probably said, well, look, the mass movement down in Manhattan is going to be Manhattan to Brooklyn. And, well, you look at a particular bridge, but probably the easiest way to do it is say, we'll put as many people as we can up onto the walkway. Then when it starts to overload, we'll plan on closing one side of the bridge or one section. Like on the Brooklyn Bridge, basically you'd close the 3 lanes, say Brooklyn bound. You could do either one, but you do one of them. And then what you do is you post just a couple of police to keep pointing pedestrians to the roadway and the walkway sections that are open at both ends. And then what you do is you can have you can either have one-way traffic on one bridge and one-way traffic on another bridge, because like the Manhattan and the Brooklyn are close together, or you could have two-way traffic, say for emergency vehicles. Again, warning people, the police would be ready to warn drivers as they get on and off, but you'd have out of these 3 lanes, you could have one lane one way, one lane the other way, and you'd very effectively have your emergency, as opposed to trying to bring a fire engine or an ambulance through with pedestrians across the entire bridge. It's funny, if you don't move the traffic that's in Manhattan out of it, then everything becomes gridlocked and nobody can move. It's funny, there's a relatively small proportion of the commuters, it's like less than 10% of the commuters in Manhattan come in by car. But that 10% creates total chaos. That and the taxis together and a few trucks, total chaos on the streets. But yeah, I think that it doesn't require necessarily coning off a whole bridge or anything. It really just requires maybe a few traffic cones at each end and a few officers who have been given a plan that says, we want to move people, we expect to evacuate, we'll start with the walkways, and when they overload, we'll use this roadway. And then if that overloads, we'll use that roadway, and have a sequence of how to get this done. And in things like the Verrazano, particularly where there are 12 lanes and 4 discrete sections, there really should be some pre-planning to say, we can take 1/4 of this bridge and delegate it to non-motorized traffic under emergency conditions, and have that plan ready to roll and understood by everybody.
We're in Stamford, Connecticut, talking with Van Wallach. Where were you the day of the big blackout in 2003?
I was in my office at 757 3rd Avenue. I work for an accounting firm, and I was there on the 15th floor. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, getting on to 4 o'clock, when it hit quite suddenly.
And you depend on an electrified train to get home to Stamford from New York every evening. What were you going to do?
Well, I had several options. My first idea was to stay at my office. Most of the people I work with live in New York, so they were going to be able to get home one way or another. But being in Connecticut, I did depend on Metro North. So my first idea was simply to stay at my office because there were restroom facilities there. There was a refrigerator. It was secure, so it seemed like the best option for me rather than going down to the streets and hoping that Grand Central would be open and the trains would be running again.
What put an end to that option?
What happened was that the security people came and cleared out the building. I had wanted to stay, but they had came and said everybody had to go. So I was the only one left in my floor, so I had to leave at that point.
What was your next option?
Well, fortunately, my cell phone was working, and I was able to call friends of mine who lived in Brooklyn, and incredibly, I was able to get through to them. And they said that I would be able to stay with them, so that became my plan, to walk to Brooklyn. Now, first, I did go to Grand Central and see if there were trains running, and nothing was happening there. The place was totally shut down. Thousands of people milling around. It was like a Stephen King movie.
So what was it like walking to Brooklyn?
Well, it was an amazing experience because you had hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. It was extremely crowded from 42nd Street on down to about 34th Street, and after that it became a little more passable. But the streets were extremely crowded with cars because of the lack of traffic signals. It was just kind of mass confusion with the traffic. Buses were trying to turn corners and were unable to make it, so you had buses kind of blocking the streets. But other than being the great density of people, I didn't have any problems, and everybody was remarkably polite and well-natured.
How important was the pedestrian mode that day?
I think the pedestrian mode was paramount, simply because with the subways not working, the trains not working, there was no other way to get around other than buses. So the pedestrian mode, and given the housing density in New York, it enabled people to get back to their homes and loved ones in a reasonable amount of time.
What was the role of the public sector in keeping order in all this potential chaos?
Well, the public sector had a very calming and authoritative role. The first thing I noticed was the presence of people from the police academy. Very easy to identify because of their uniforms, not like regular members of the NYPD. And they were directing traffic. They were out there. It's a calming feeling to know that you have some kind of a public authority out there keeping an eye on everything, directing traffic, answering questions. People are able to make their way home on their own, but having some kind of a police or civil defense presence provides more of a framework for things going on, so it's not just like millions of people running around like ants. It gives it some kind of sense of direction, and that was important.
We're in Albany, New York, talking with Ivan Vamos, who's a retired Deputy Commissioner of State Parks and former transportation planner as well.
Hello.
What work have you done in terms of evacuation planning?
Well, I was a lead for New York State's evacuation for hurricane planning in Long Island, New York, Westchester County. We were very vulnerable because a lot of the area is prone to flooding in the case of hurricanes, and some other additional weather patterns.
What's the key thing to keep in mind when you're doing that sort of evacuation planning?
Well, first thing is to pay attention to what the weather systems are altogether, and the State Emergency Management Office keeps us well in gear for that, and then set up a program to move people. Of course, if you're moving people by mass transit or another means, you have to have enough capacity and you have to get them to move earlier. One of my concerns after 9/11, and I was in New York City for a meeting at that time, and the subsequent blackout, is that at least in the central parts of the city, mass transit doesn't work. So one of my interests, which is bicycle pedestrian planning, is that good bicycle pedestrian systems be put together in such a way as to move people in a case of an emergency.
Now, what do you need to look at when you're trying to get pedestrians out of Manhattan or out of Brooklyn? Where do you start?
It depends on what emergency you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a terrorist act, that was the case with 9/11, then you basically have to move them relatively short way immediately, but that has to happen immediately. If you're dealing with a coastal storm, which I'm much more used to because I spent about 20 years working with that, then you have to work ahead of time and identify the routes that they're going to take, make sure those are safe, easy to find, easy to move. We're lucky in New York State that there are high grounds. Practically all areas have them. There are safe places, but that you have to tell the people where to get to, and you have to combine this with other programs that improve the bicycle pedestrian systems. We have a greenway system that I was fortunate to chair before I had retired, and that will serve a lot of people at a critical time. We have to provide signs. There are evacuation signs that link to a route. Sorry about the wind.
Yeah.
And these have to be set up along with the routes. It's an inexpensive program, and it can be combined with things like providing safe access to schools.
And this actually could be something that works well together. Are schools used very often as evacuation sites? Would it make sense to have people walking toward them?
In New York City, for example, most of the evacuation shelters are schools that were selected on high grounds. So there are schools in safe locations in Westchester County, in New York City, and to some extent in Long Island, that are on high enough ground to be designated. They have been designated. The routes have to be improved. And some of the greenways are perfect routes to get people there. And by the way, it's a perfect route to get students there during the other days when there is no emergency.
Now, what's the general status of evacuation planning around the United States? Are we doing what needs to be done now so that people will be able to walk or bicycle to safety when the emergency does happen?
Well, I had commented on the publication in Governing, a magazine, that this has to be done a lot better, and I was fortunate in that they picked up my article and printed it. I had also commented on other public documents, for instance, the emergency plans for mass transit by the Federal Department of Transportation, which basically ignores the bicycle pedestrian issue, even though it's a critical element in getting people to and from mass transit systems. So we have to pay attention to that, and we have to not depend exclusively on motorized transportation to do it. It's cheap, it works, it worked in 9/11, it worked in the case of the Blackout, and we just have to improve it.
We're in Cabin John, Maryland, where the Capital Beltway crosses over the Potomac River. We're in Montgomery County, Maryland, the most populous county in the state of Maryland. And across the river is Fairfax County, Virginia, the most populous county in the state of Virginia. But if you're on foot or bicycle and you want to go between the two, you're out of luck. This is the only bridge between the two counties, and there's no provision for pedestrians or bicycles. You have to go all the way into the District of Columbia, over to Arlington County, Virginia, and then back out. Makes a relatively short trip way too long to handle. This is a nuisance for day-to-day travel, but could be a real problem in an emergency if someone on foot had to get from the one county to the other. What could be done to provide for pedestrians on a bridge like this? Well, the most obvious is to have sidewalks along the side, and they could be retrofitted by cantilevering out from the side of the bridge. In some places, you put the sidewalk down the center. It avoids problems with exit ramps at the ends of the bridge. In the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, they elevate the sidewalk up above the roadway. It makes it a little more pleasant. The Bell Island Bridge in Richmond, Virginia, they suspend the pedestrian way underneath the bridge, which actually gets it down lower to the level where pedestrians are going to want to be when you have a high bridge like that. That's probably the best solution here. You have a pretty high bridge, but you're going to be low down near the C&O Canal on the Maryland side. So suspending a pedestrian bridge underneath could be the best solution. When you get to the Virginia side, you make your way up to the local road network, and you'd be able to get between the two counties on foot. Something that's just not possible now.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.